Princess Aura Tolliver was an innocent victim killed when investigators say members of a Sanford gang called On Top Forever, or OTF, opened fire on the van she was riding in with friends in January last year.
Somebody puts it out on the internet. I see my daughter dead on a Sprinter van on the internet. That's just hard. It was just... Man.
Tolliver's father, Edward's been waiting for justice, and yesterday, the Seminole County Sheriff announced 13 people are now in jail charged with Princess's murder and racketeering.
I'm glad that those 13, 14 people are off the street and no one else can be harmed by them. They deserve... jails are too good of a place for them.
So there was a public argument between two rappers on social media. Detectives believe a local gang wanted to prove themselves by shooting one of those rappers while they were performing here in Sanford. But ultimately, 6 innocent victims were shot. Now, this photo that's coming up on your screen, this is Princess Tolliver. She was shot and killed in that drive-by shooting. 5 others were hurt. The sheriff says rapper Jackboy had a concert at the barn in Sanford back in January 2023. Jackboy left in an SUV, and a group with him left in a Mercedes Sprinter van, and they were driving behind him on Reinhardt Road when the shots rang out. Sheriff's detectives say members of a local gang, OTF, which is affiliated with the Crips, one of the largest street gangs in the country, thought Jackboy was in the van that those women were in. And that's why deputies say they shot into it with armor-piercing bullets. Now, there was a public feud between Jackboy and rapper Kodak Black. Deputies believe the local gang tried to shoot Jackboy for street validation. The sheriff's office doesn't believe Kodak Black was involved at all and did not pay them to shoot anyone. After months of tireless investigating, 8 suspects were arrested. The other 5 who are facing charges were already in jail. Sheriff Dennis Lima hopes these arrests bring some peace to the community after a very scary and tragic shooting.
She was young, full of life, and had a future that stretched far beyond what anyone could imagine. Princess Aura Tolliver was more than just an influencer. She was a daughter, a friend, a woman with dreams that should have never been cut short. But on the night of January 16, 2023, everything changed. In the blink of an eye, her name would no longer be attached to beauty and inspiration, but to tragedy, bloodshed, and the senseless violence of a world she never asked to be part of. She had no enemies, no gang ties, no reason to be afraid, and yet she would become the target of bullets meant for someone else, a casualty of a war she wasn't fighting, a conflict between 2 men played out on social media, escalating beyond words into something irreversible. The shots that rang out that night were not random. They were intentional, calculated. But the killers made a mistake that would cost an innocent woman her life. The concert had ended, music had filled the air, people were laughing, celebrating, moving on with their night. And Princess, she was simply going home. But as the van pulled away from the barn in Sanford, Florida, someone was watching, someone was waiting, and within seconds, chaos erupted. Gunfire ripped through the air, shattering the silence, shattering glass, shattering lives. 6 women were shot, 6 lives forever changed. And in the middle of it all, one woman would never make it out alive. Her name, forever etched into headlines, another statistic in a war that had nothing to do with her. This wasn't just a stray bullet. This wasn't an accident. This was the result of a long-standing feud between 2 men, 2 rappers, 2 former friends turned bitter rivals. But in their war, it was an innocent woman who paid the ultimate price. So how did this happen? How did a simple night out turn into a crime scene? And who really pulled the trigger? January 16, 2023. A night meant for music, celebration, and fleeting moments of joy. Jackboy had just stepped off the stage at the barn in Sanford, Florida. The energy of the night still hung in the air. Fans spilling into the streets, voices buzzing with excitement, the pulse of the city carrying on as it always did. But in the shadows, something else was set in motion, something that couldn't be undone. Princess Aura Tolliver was just one of many leaving the venue that night. She wasn't a performer. She wasn't a performer. She wasn't part of any feud. She was simply there, caught in the rhythm of the evening, moving from one moment to the next with no way of knowing what was about to unfold. She climbed into a van, surrounded by friends. 6 women, all heading home, all unaware that their final moments of peace were slipping away. Then, without warning, the silence shattered. A burst of gunfire ripped through the night. It wasn't a single shot. It was relentless, calculated, the kind of violence meant to send a message. Bullets tore through metal, glass exploding in every direction. Screams echoed inside the van. Panic, confusion, terror. The force of the impact sent bodies reeling. One moment, they were simply driving. The next, they were in a war zone. And when the shooting stopped, the damage was irreversible. 6 women had been hit. Some clutched their wounds, fighting to stay conscious, others in shock, unable to process what had just happened. But one woman wouldn't get back up. One woman wouldn't make it home. Princess Aura Tolliver was gone. The chaos didn't end with the last gunshot. The flashing lights of ambulances painted the night in streaks of red and blue. Paramedics rushed to the scene, working against time, trying to undo what had already been done. Bystanders watched, horrified, as law enforcement flooded the area. And as the reality set in, one question echoed through the city, through the community, through every headline that would follow. Why? Why had this happened? Who had done this? And most importantly, she wasn't a rival. She wasn't part of a gang. She wasn't in the music industry. Princess Aura Tolliver had no connection to the feud that would ultimately claim her life. And yet, in a moment of violence meant for someone else, her future was stolen. At 31 years old, Princess Aura was so much more than the headlines would later reduce her to. She was a daughter, a friend, an inspiration to those who knew her. She had dreams, ambitions, and a life that extended far beyond a single tragic night. By day, she worked as a civilian employee for the Florida State University Police Department, a job that placed her close to law enforcement, but never on the wrong side of it. Her life was one of stability, hard work, and passion. Online, she shared pieces of herself. Her love for beauty, fashion, and self-expression. She had built a presence, an audience, a world that was uniquely hers. Those who knew her remember her kindness, her energy, the light she carried into every room she entered. She was never someone who sought out danger. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't the kind of person who got caught up in the chaos of street violence. But none of that mattered in the end. On January 16, 2023, none of the choices she had made in life could protect her from the choices made by others. In an instant, all of it was gone. The laughter, the late-night talks with friends, the small moments that made up the fabric of her existence, erased by a hail of bullets meant for someone else. And now, in the wake of it all, those who loved her are left with nothing but memories. The pain of what could have been, the weight of a life unfinished, and the haunting realization that she was never supposed to be a target, but she became one anyway. The question remains, who fired the shots that took her life? And more importantly, to understand the tragedy of January 16, 2023, we have to go back to a story that didn't begin with Princess Aura Tolliver. It began with 2 men, 2 friends who became enemies, 2 artists whose personal war would turn into something far bigger than just words. Jackboy and Kodak Black, 2 names that once stood side by side in the rap industry, would become locked in a battle that would stretch beyond music, beyond the internet, and into something real, something deadly. Jackboy and Kodak Black weren't just collaborators. They were like family. Childhood friends who rose through the ranks of the music industry together, each carrying the weight of their past, their struggles, their ambitions. They had made it, but success, as it often does, came with cracks beneath the surface. And eventually, those cracks became too deep to ignore. No one knows exactly when the shift happened. Some say it was money. Others say it was ego. What's certain is that by the time the world took notice, it was already too late. What started as a few social media jabs, posts laced with subtle shade, exploded into full-scale attacks. Instagram live rants, Twitter shots, cryptic lyrics that left little room for interpretation. The tension was growing, the distance between them turning from words into something more dangerous. And the public, they watched it all unfold like a spectacle. Like entertainment. But this wasn't just entertainment for those involved. The words turned to threats. The threats turned into real-world confrontations. And as time went on, what was once an internet beef became something the streets couldn't ignore. Their followers, friends, affiliates, and those looking to prove their loyalty took sides, and in this world, taking sides often comes with consequences. Law enforcement had been watching. They knew the names, the affiliations, the history. Kodak Black had his own legal troubles, arrests, probation, a constant presence in the court system. Jackboy, too, had his own battles. And yet, no matter how many charges, how many warnings, the feud didn't stop. It only escalated. And with each post, each diss track, each moment of defiance, the foundation for something bigger, something irreversible, was being laid. But when the gunfire erupted outside the barn that night, it wasn't Jackboy who was hit. It wasn't Kodak Black. It was an innocent woman, caught in the crossfire of a war she never had any part in. The bullets were meant for someone else. But that doesn't change the reality. That doesn't bring Princess Aura Tolliver back. And now, in the aftermath of it all, the only thing left to ask is, who pulled the trigger? And how far had this feud really gone? She was never supposed to be the one. The bullets that tore through that van weren't meant for Princess Aura Tolliver. She didn't know the men who pulled the trigger. She had no enemies, no debts to pay, no part in the feud that led to this moment. And yet, in an instant, her life was taken. Not because of who she was, but because of who they thought she was. The gunman had one target in mind, Jackboy. A man deeply entrenched in a war that had been playing out for years. A man whose name carried weight far beyond the music. That night, in the darkness outside the barn, they believed they had him. They believed they had their moment. And so, without hesitation, they opened fire. It was quick, it was brutal, and it was wrong. Inside that van, there was no Jackboy, no rival to settle the score with, no one who had any stake in the violence unfolding in the streets. Just 6 women, unaware of the danger that had already marked them. They weren't ducking for cover. They weren't looking over their shoulders, because why would they? This wasn't their fight. But that night, it didn't matter. That night, it didn't matter. That night, innocence wasn't enough to protect them. Gunfire ripped through the vehicle, shattering glass, puncturing metal, tearing through flesh. Chaos, screams, blood pooling onto the seats. The seconds stretched into eternity, the van transforming from a simple ride home into a death trap. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The shooters vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but destruction. 6 women shot. 1 dead, 1 name, now etched into a tragedy that should never have happened. Princess Aura Tolliver was gone because of a mistake, because of a miscalculation, because in that moment someone thought they were taking a life that mattered to them. Instead, they stole a life that mattered to so many others. But the story wasn't over, not yet, because law enforcement wasn't going to let this end in the dark. The city wanted answers. The world wanted justice. And soon, The walls would begin to close in on those responsible. A crime this violent, this reckless, wasn't going to be ignored. The bloodshed outside the barn had left an entire city shaken, and law enforcement knew they had to act fast. The investigation started immediately, with one goal in mind: find the shooters. Find the people who turned a van full of innocent women into a target. Detectives combed through surveillance footage, analyzed ballistic evidence, and traced the events leading up to that night. And soon, they found their first breakthrough. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It wasn't a heat of the moment decision. It was something much bigger. Something organized, a coordinated hit carried out by members of a powerful gang. On top forever, a faction of the Crips. For law enforcement, this changed everything. What first seemed like a deadly mistake was now part of a much larger criminal network, one that had left a trail of violence long before Princess Aura Tolliver's name was ever spoken. And now, that trail had led straight to them. Surveillance footage, witness testimonies, forensic evidence. It all pointed to the same conclusion. This was a planned attack, but the killers had gotten it horribly wrong. And that mistake, it was about to cost them everything. One by one, the arrests came. Law enforcement moved quickly, executing search warrants, kicking in doors, and rounding up suspects across multiple locations. By the time the dust settled, 13 people were in custody, charged with first-degree murder, attempted murder, and racketeering under the RICO Act. For Sheriff Dennis Lemmer, the message was clear. This wasn't just about solving one case. This was about taking down an operation, cutting the roots of a criminal enterprise that had been terrorizing the streets for too long. In front of the cameras, he laid it out for the public. We're not just looking at a single shooting. We're looking at a network. We're looking at gang violence that has escalated beyond control. And now we're putting a stop to it. The mugshots of the suspects flashed across news screens, their faces now tied to a crime that had gripped an entire community. For some, it was justice. For others, it was only the beginning, because arrests were one thing, but convictions, that was another battle entirely. And as the case moved forward, the question remained: who would pay the ultimate price for the life that was lost? Justice was closing in. 13 arrests, a criminal network exposed. The city had seen the faces of those accused of carrying out the shooting that claimed Princess Aura Tolliver's life. But there was one face missing, one name still unaccounted for: Trevon Law. While law enforcement had swept up most of the suspects, Trevon Law remained a ghost, slipping through the cracks, vanishing into the very streets that had shaped him. His name was on the warrants. His face was plastered across news reports, yet no one had him in handcuffs, and that made him dangerous. Sheriff Dennis Lemmer made it clear this wasn't over. Trevon Law wasn't just another fugitive. He was a piece of the puzzle, one of the final links to the night that ended in gunfire and tragedy. His capture wasn't a matter of if. We know who he is, we know what he's done, and we will find him. But finding him wouldn't be easy. The streets have a way of protecting their own. Whispers moved faster than warrants. The right connections, the right places to hide. Trevon Law had every reason to run, every incentive to stay one step ahead. And as long as he remained free, the case remained open, the wounds unhealed, the justice incomplete. Somewhere out there, Trevon Law is looking over his shoulder. He knows what's coming. He knows time is running out. The question is, how long can he run before the law catches up? When the bullets stopped flying, when the chaos settled, one name echoed louder than the rest: Kodak Black. Whispers spread like wildfire. The internet speculated, fingers pointed and theories ran rampant. Was Kodak Black the mastermind? Had the feud between him and Jackboy escalated to the point of no return? Had it claimed a life? Law enforcement had an answer. There is no evidence tying Kodak Black to this shooting, Sheriff Dennis Lemmer stated firmly. But in the court of public opinion, facts didn't always matter. Kodak Black's long history with Jackboy made him an easy target for speculation. The feud between the two wasn't just personal. It was public. It was played out in diss tracks, cryptic Instagram posts, and legal battles. To some, it was only a matter of time before it turned deadly. But was Kodak Black truly responsible for what happened that night? Sheriff Lemmer's message was clear. Kodak Black hadn't been charged, hadn't been named as a suspect, hadn't been linked to the crime. Yet, the weight of speculation followed him. A name that once dominated music charts was now entangled in a tragedy. He claimed no part in a tragedy. He claimed no part in. And still, the question lingered. Did the war of word between him and Jackboy create the very conditions that led to the deadly mistake? One thing was certain. Princess Aura Tolliver was gone. A feud had escalated beyond rap battles and online insults. And whether Kodak Black had a role in it or not, the damage was already done. A beat drops. A verse is laid down. A rivalry is born. Rap has always been about storytelling, about pain, struggle, survival. But sometimes the words go beyond the music. Sometimes the feuds that start in a studio don't stay there. Sometimes they spill into the streets. And when they do, the consequences are real. This wasn't the first time rap beef led to gunfire, and it won't be the last. Tupac and Biggie, two legends lost to a war that began with words. King Von, Young Dolph, Takeoff. Names that once headlined concerts now etched into memorials. The lines between music and violence have blurred for years, and the cycle keeps repeating itself. The feud between Jackboy and Kodak Black wasn't supposed to end like this. It wasn't supposed to claim the life of an innocent woman. But it did. And that's the reality of the world we live in. Rap is more than music. For some, it's a way out. For others, it's a battleground. And for people like Princess Aura Tolliver, it's a danger they never signed up for. This isn't just about one night in Sanford, Florida. It's about a culture that glorifies the very violence it condemns. It's about how one moment, one misunderstanding, one bullet can change everything. The music industry thrives on conflict, but when the cameras turn off and the microphones are muted, the bloodshed doesn't stop. How many more names will be added to the list? How many more lives will be lost over words that were never meant to be taken this far? Princess Aura Tolliver wasn't a rapper. She wasn't in a gang. She was just in the wrong place, at the wrong time, caught in the crossfire of a war she had no part in. And now she's another name in a story that keeps repeating itself. The music plays on. Beefs continue. But at what cost? A life full of dreams. A future full of promise. A night that should have been just another moment in time. But for Princess Aura Tolliver, it was her last. She wasn't a rapper caught in a feud. She wasn't looking for trouble. She wasn't supposed to be a target. But none of that mattered. A van filled with friends. A night that should have ended with laughter and memories. Instead, gunfire, panic, screams. In just seconds, everything changed. And for her family, for her friends, for the people who loved her, nothing would ever be the same again. How many more times does this have to happen? How many more lives will be stolen by bullets meant for someone else? How many more innocent names will be added to a list that's already too long? Princess Aura Tolliver didn't start this war, but she paid the price for it, and she won't be the last unless something changes. Rap beefs, they start as words. Lyrics, posts, diss tracks. But words have power. Words turn into actions. Actions turn into bullets, and the cycle continues. It's easy to watch from the outside, to see the headlines, to move on to the next story. But for those left behind, there is no moving on. There is only grief, only questions that will never have answers, only a future that will never be what it should have been. So now we ask you, how do we stop this? How do we keep this from happening again? How do we break this cycle before another innocent life is lost? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you want more in-depth stories like this, real cases, real tragedies, the real consequences of violence, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and help us shine a light on the stories that need to be told. Because silence doesn't stop the bullets, and ignoring the problem doesn't make it go away. Rest in peace, Princess Aura Tolliver. You deserved so much more.